Bibles to 1 Kings. If you need a Bible, slip your hand up and Pastor Don will get you one. But we're picking up in 1 Kings 21. Now we're still dealing in these next couple of chapters with Ahab, King Ahab, the most wicked king that there was in the northern kingdom of Israel. Partially because he was under the influence of his pagan wife Jezebel. And we know what that name has come to mean, and we'll look at that in a minute. But at this point, here in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 24, Ahab decides he wants a vegetable garden next to his house in Jezreel. Next to his palace in Jezreel. That piece of property happens to be owned by a guy named Naboth who has a vineyard there. Now, Ahab offered to either buy it from him or do an exchange to give him another piece of property, but Naboth refuses because it's the family property. And we remember how, as we went through the earlier books, how things were distributed, how the land was distributed. It was given to certain families, and they were very serious about the land and careful about how because it was to continue on in their families. So Naboth refuses to sell it to Ahab, and Ahab goes back to his palace there in Jezreel and sulks. Here we see a prime example of coveting. Like in the Ten Commandments, last of the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, thou shalt not covet, your neighbor's stuff, your neighbor's wife, anything that belongs to your neighbor, you shall not covet. Covet meaning to strongly desire what is somebody else's. And so many will find, and we'll see even later, that many evils come from the idea or having a covetous heart. And as Jesus said in Luke 12:15, and he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. That's not what your life is. Your life isn't all your stuff. But in a culture that's so marketed as ours is, you get the idea that it is all about stuff. Do you have the latest phone? Do you have the latest this, the latest that? If not, you're out of it. Now we see in verses 5 through 14, Jezebel comes along. And she asked Ahab what the problem is. And he tells her, explains the situation. She says, I'll take care of it. So she writes a letter to the elders of the city and forges, basically, seals it with his signet ring, signs his name, all of that, like it's coming from him. She tells him, declare a fast, invite Naboth, and put him at the head of the table, all this, make it look good. Then have a couple of guys come in and say, we heard he blasphemed God. So, the scripture says, out of the mouth of two or more witnesses, something will be established, an issue will be established. So they convict him under that and then put him and then stone him to death. Now, this, you could say, is an early example of lawfare, because that's exactly what they did. They used the law, they manipulated the law in order to bring a charge against Naboth and kill him. So then in verses 15 and 16, Ahab takes possession of the vineyard after Naboth is dead. He may have thought that he was okay because he really didn't do the dirty deed himself. But then in verses 17 through 29, we see that Elijah, well, the Lord tells Elijah to go to Ahab and pronounce judgment on him. He tells him that God will do to him and his house the same he did to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, his house, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and also to the guy that followed his dynasty, Baasha. And he also tells him that the dogs will eat Jezebel, and dogs will also lick Ahab's blood where they licked Naboth's. Ahab humbles himself at this point, so God says, most of this isn't going to happen while you're still alive. It's going to happen, but it's not going to happen while you're alive. And here we see how God carefully sorts out and judges evil. Because, he knows the mouth behind the king, Jezebel, so he pronounces judgment on her specifically, as well as on Ahab. Jezebel provoked Ahab to evil, to acting like a pagan. She was a pagan. She was a Baal worshiper from long back with her family up in Sidon. But he was from Israel. Supposed to be following the Lord, supposed to be God's people. Now, in Revelation 2:20, we have a mention of her name here. And you see what it implies here is the character. As it says in Revelation 2:20, nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. So you see what a Jezebel is a person that is a woman that influences others to do evil. That's what, I don't think there was actually I could be wrong, but in that church in Revelation 2:20, I don't think there was actually a lady named Jezebel, but the name was being used to imply or to spell out what she was doing and the influence she was having. Because, to be honest, how many women have you met named Jezebel? Not too many. You have? 2? Oh, they haven't read the background on that name. They really haven't. Because, for years, people wouldn't because the connotation behind the name. Now, in chapter 22, we have a continuing story, actually we'll be wrapping up with Ahab here. Because here we see Micaiah, warns Ahab about going into battle with the king of Syria. What takes place here is Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. Remember, he was beaten before, and he promised to give back all the cities that he took and let them set up markets in Damascus. Well, he didn't return the city of Ramoth Gilead as he had promised to. So at this time, Jehoshaphat from Judah was visiting Ahab, who asked him to go into battle with him against the Syrians. Now, Jehoshaphat wanted to inquire of the word of the Lord first. But first, Ahab gets a bunch of pagan prophets, and they start pronouncing, oh, go into battle. The Lord's going to give you the victory. One guy even pulled out some horns and said, this is how you're going to gore the army of the Syrians. You know, a whole production, all of this going on. Jehoshaphat still wants to hear from a prophet of the Lord. So the only guy he knows of this time in the area was Micaiah. Micaiah comes, you know, at first he didn't want to bring him, and Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, I don't like this guy. He's always prophesying bad concerning me. And Jehoshaphat says, don't say that. And it's fine, it's good. So Micaiah comes and first sarcastically goes along with all the false prophets saying, go in, the Lord give it into your hand. Go for it, dude. But then he declares Ahab's death in accordance with Elijah's earlier prophecy that we had just seen. So, okay, they take this, they hear that. So now they're still going into battle. And Ahab has Jehoshaphat wear his own robes. He's wearing his own robes as a king, while Ahab goes into the battle in common clothes, kind of incognito. Now, at first, when they're fighting the Syrians, they've been told, only fight with the king of Israel. So they see Jehoshaphat in his robes and think, oh, that must be the king of Israel. So they start going after him. And then in the battlefield, he cries out to the Lord. Then the Syrians say, well, that's not Ahab. So they stop following him. And so they're just fighting. Some guy goes, ding, and just kind of shoots an arrow off in the air. It goes between Ahab's armor. And, you know, he's wounded. He's laying there in his chariot, tells his men to take him out of the battle. And he is. And Jehoshaphat, you know, this guy, he was a very good king, but he tended to flirt with evil by association. As it says in 1 Corinthians 15:3, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits, or good morals is in the Old King James, I believe. So as we see, this, you know, as we will see later, this will almost, Jehoshaphat's flirting with evil will almost cause the destruction of David's line that leads to the Messiah. Almost. We'll see that in future studies. Compromising with evil never helps your cause. As is still true today, we find in progressive Christianity, which is just really old liberalism. Compromise with evil isn't progress. It's sin, and it takes us backwards. So in verses 37 through 40 of chapter 22, we see that the army of Israel, they're fleeing from the battle. Everybody's going to their own camp, and Ahab dies and is brought back to Samaria. As they're washing out the chariot by the pool of Samaria, dogs are licking up his blood, as Elijah prophesied would happen. You know, prophecy is always eventually going to be fulfilled. There's just different timers set on each prophecy. Now we see in 41 through 50 it describes Jehoshaphat's reign in Judah down in the south. You know, it would probably be helpful for you at some time to look up, do a Google search of the kings of Israel and Judah and look at one of those charts, and you see how they all fall down, because it gets confusing, especially as we'll see later. There's a king in Israel and a king in Judah with the same name. So that totally confuses everybody. So Jehoshaphat reigns in Judah, and it says there that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. His only shortcoming was that he left the high places. That was places on hills and mountains where people worshiped according to their own terms, in the way they wanted to. Again, like in Judges, everyone doing what is right in his own eyes. Jehoshaphat didn't want, and it's interesting later, he didn't want Ahaziah's men to sail with him in his ships. He didn't want a repeat of what happened with Ahab. But again, he has more problems after this. You have to beware not to be associated with evil and bear the consequences of that evil. So now we see we're switching back to the north, to Israel again, and Ahaziah, the son of Ahab. And we're told here that his evil reign lasted only 2 years. He walked in the ways of Ahab, Jezebel, and Jeroboam. So he was kind of one bad package. He worshiped Baal and provoked the Lord to anger. And then now going to 2 Kings. We're switching over here. We've ended with Ahab. Now we're turning our attention back to, actually we're seeing first of all God's judgment on Ahaziah. He's injured. In fact, he's up in his upper room in his palace, and there's a lattice work up there. He must have been leaning against it or something, and he falls through it. This is in the city of Samaria. Then he's injured, and he wants to know, he's curious, will I recover or not? So he sends messengers to the Philistine city of Ekron to inquire of the god Beelzebub. Now you've probably heard the name before, Beelzebub. It literally means Lord of the Flies. Now why would you want to worship or consult a god that was called Lord of the Flies? And even back then, those guys who worshiped Beelzebub, they would carry little like rocks carved in to look at like a fly. They would carry them around in their pocket as kind of like an amulet sort of thing. If they wanted to pray to Beelzebub, you pull out your rock and pray to your rock. So he sends these messengers, or he sends them out from Samaria to see whether he will recover or not from his accident, from his condition. But Elijah, and we see in verses 3 and 4, intercepts the messengers and tells them to go back to Ahab with both a question and a judgment. The question is it because there's no God in Israel that you inquire of Beelzebub? Is it that there's no God here in the land that you have to go ask for this fly god? The judgment that was pronounced was that Ahaziah would not come down from his bed, but would die. And this brings up the question to me, is it because the Lord is not in America that people search for their fulfillment and so many other things? It's sort of a similar question in that they're looking for, in a sense, God in all the wrong places, but not in sincerity going to the Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jesus Christ, his son. So now we get this interesting picture in verses 5 through 16. Ahaziah first sends out this commander with 50 men to go and basically arrest Elijah and bring him back. Well, the first guy goes down there and says, "Come with me, you man of God." And Elijah said, "If I'm a man of God, let fire come down out of heaven and consume you." And it happens just that way. Him and his 50 people, 50 soldiers. And then Ahaziah sends out a second guy. Same story. He says, come with, and he has, again, 50 people with him. And he says, "Come down, O man of God." And again, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down and consume you guys. Happens again. Ahaziah sends out a third commander with 50 guys. This time, the commander has some sense. He goes and says, and falls down before Elijah and says, "Oh, may our lives be precious to you," because he's begging for mercy. He knows what happened to the first two guys in their troops. And so he pleads for his life and the life of his men. And the Lord tells Elijah to go with the commander then and tells Ahaziah to face what is going to happen to him. Interesting, this whole issue of calling fire down out of heaven. In Luke chapter 9, verses 54 through 56, we have Jesus and his disciples were going through Samaria, somewhere close, not too far from this area. And it says, "And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, and saw that they were rejected, the people didn't want to accept them because they were on their way to Jerusalem. They said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?' But he turned and rebuked them and said, 'You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them.' And they went to another village." We're not called to call down judgment upon people, but to share the message of the gospel of the grace of God. Different dispensation, different time. This is what we're called to do. Now, in verses 17 through 18, Ahaziah dies according to the word of the Lord because he has no son to take his place. His younger brother, Jehoram, becomes king of Israel. He begins, now listen to this, he begins his reign in the second year of the reign of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Yes, they both have the same name. Now, this is part of Jehoshaphat flirting with evil, hanging out with Ahab, and they both named their sons the same name. He was possibly trying to identify, in a sense, with the world in this. Now in chapter 2, we have the story of how Elijah gets out of here. How he's taken up to heaven in verses 1 through 11. When the Lord is getting ready to take Elijah to heaven, he leaves Gilgal. Remember, Gilgal was the first place that Israel camped when they crossed the Jordan River. And he leaves there and he travels to Bethel. Now, Elisha, another issue here is not just two kings named the same thing, but you have two prophets whose names are really close. And don't be surprised if I mess it up a couple of times in these chapters saying their names. So Elisha refuses to stay behind as Elijah asked him to, sensing that God was about to do something. Something was going to happen. In Bethel, the sons of the prophets. Now, the sons of the prophets, it's the same as the school of the prophets. And what it probably was, what many believe happened is Samuel. Remember Samuel from the past, that he actually established the school of the prophets. These guys that are called the sons of the prophets for training of young prophets. And the sons of the prophets ask Elisha if he knows what is about to happen. He said, yeah, I know, be quiet. That's how he told him. I know, just be quiet. I got something going here. Then Elijah and Elisha go to Jericho, and then they go to the Jordan River with 50 of the sons of the prophets following them. Elijah goes to the Jordan River and takes off his mantle. A mantle, no, he's not walking around with a fireplace fixture. He has, what they had was like, it was part of a garment. It was kind of more firm. It was like pads on the shoulders that they would wear, and it identified them as a prophet. Well, he takes his off, strikes the Jordan River with it, and it parts. And then they cross over, both he and Elisha. Then Elijah asked Elisha what he wants before he's taken up, to which he replies, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. He's asking, I just want to be blessed twice as much as you have been. I want twice your anointing. Elisha tells him that if he sees him taken up, he'll have what he asked for. A chariot of fire comes down in between Elijah and Elisha, and Elijah is taken away, and his mantle falls to the ground. So Elisha sees it and picks up the mantle, as we'll see. Here we see Elisha hungering after all that God has for him. So I want a double portion. I'm not satisfied, where I am. I want to be closer to the Lord. I want to know him better. I want to be used more by the Lord. I want to know him. As we've seen Paul say in Philippians, that I might know him in the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his suffering, being conformed to the image of his death, but that by some means I might attain to the resurrection of the dead, or all of that being applied to his life now, not to be satisfied where he was with the Lord. We can seek to compartmentalize our relationship with the Lord in order to get what we want for ourselves and think we're manipulating God, but it never works out. The real question is, do you want to be as close to God as possible or as close to the world as possible? We've seen this being played out like with Jehoshaphat, wanting to be in the kingdom but want to be close to the world as well. Imagine how God could have used him even in greater ways if he was fully devoted. You never know what God wants to do in your life until you totally yield yourself to him. As it says in Romans 12, 1 and 2, I beseech you, or I beg you. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove or outwardly demonstrate what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So in verses 12 through 15, we see that Elisha is acknowledged as Elijah's successor. I even typed it wrong. So Elisha picks up the mantle, goes back to the river, strikes the river from the other side and says, and declares, where is the Lord God of Elijah? The water divides and Elijah crosses back over to where the sons of the prophets are. At this point, they declare, oh, look, the spirit of Elijah is on Elisha. So they recognize the working of God in his life. And it's interesting. Remember, John the Baptist was supposed to come, according to the prophecy, the Messiah wouldn't come until Elijah comes first. And Jesus declared that John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah. And so he was the fulfillment of that prophecy. When we pursue all that God has for us, we then become examples of faith to others. And they see the possibility of going on and growing closer in the relationship with the Lord. You see, this is the responsibility we have as believers, to be examples, to show people, to demonstrate to people what it means to have a relationship with God, what it really looks like. Not just some religious activity. Now, these young prophets then, the sons of the prophets, in verses 16 through 18, they want to search for Elijah. So maybe God took him up somewhere and he just plopped him down some other place. We got to look for him. Now, at first, Elisha doesn't want to do it because he saw Elijah go up in the chariot of fire. He isn't coming back. So they keep pestering him until he feels guilty and lets them go. And then they go around, look for him, don't find him anywhere. They come back and report, and he says, I told you, we weren't going to find him anywhere. So for obvious reasons, their search was fruitless. Now we have in verses 19 through 25 a couple early miracles associated with Elisha. First of all, he goes back to Jericho, and the water coming into the city was bitter. It wasn't drinkable. So he has them put salt in the water, and the water is healed and drinkable. And even as the book, the Kings, the author, whoever he is, says it's still that way until this time. To the best of my knowledge, still is. You can drink the water in Jericho. Now, he left there to go to Bethel. Now, on the way, a group of youth, probably a bunch of teenage boys or something, looking for trouble, come up and start harassing him and saying to him, come down, oh, you bald head. Because it's likely that Elisha was bald-headed on the top, and, by some then it was seen as a curse, so they used it as an excuse to ridicule him. So he pronounces a curse on him. And this mother bear comes down and mauls all these guys. So it's like, okay, we're learning, don't mess with Elisha. Now, chapter 3. Jehoram reigns in, see, we're kind of going back. We saw where Jehoram became king. We switched to the south again. Now we're switching back up to the north, getting a description of Jehoram's rule. As it says, Jehoram, the king of Israel, reigns for 12 years, continues worshiping calves and the Baals. He continues in the sins of his father and mother, as well as the sins of Jeroboam. And then, as we see in verses 4 and 5, Moab rebels against them, against Jehoram specifically, because Ahab had control over Moab, and so he was getting tribute and things like that, payments from. He was getting sheep, things like that from Moab. But after Ahab died, they rebelled against Jehoram. Now, Jehoram musters his army and then asks Jehoshaphat, who's still king in Judah, to join him. Jehoshaphat tells him, and this is what, guy, let's get some sense here. He says, what's mine is yours, basically. My armies are as your armies, and all of that sort of thing. Saying, like, we're one, we're brothers here. He compromises again being associated with wickedness. On the way to battle, they pick up the king of Edom. Remember, Edom are the descendants of Esau. They pick them up. What they're doing is they're going around the west side of the Dead Sea, and they're going to come up under the bottom of the Dead Sea. Down there, it doesn't quite go there. Yeah. They're going to go down around this way over to Moab. And that city there we'll discuss in a minute. Kir Hareset. So they're going around that way. As I said, they pick up the king of Edom, go around there. Now, as they're going down there, they've been marching 7 days, and there's no water. So they start saying, has the Lord led us out here to kill all these armies that we might fall before the king of Moab? So Jehoshaphat, to his credit, asked if there's a prophet of the Lord in the area. And Elisha just happens to be in the area. And they call him, he comes, and he tells Jehoram that the only reason that he came was because Jehoshaphat was there. If Jehoshaphat wasn't there, I wouldn't have shown up. I'll let you guys out on your own. He refers to God as the Lord of hosts before whom I stand. The idea is he stands before the Lord waiting for orders. I'll listen and do what he tells me to do. It's like a person who stands in the presence of a king waiting to be directed by that king. Elisha is saying here that basically he's an open book because he knew who he stood before and whom he served. It was easy to distinguish or determine what Elisha was going to do because he was consistently following the Lord. You could come at him with all kinds of angles and everything, and he said, nope. So now in 16 through 20, we see that these three kings go to war against Mesha, the king of Moab. Elisha tells them, here they are out there without any water. He tells them, go start digging little ditches all around here. And so they do that. And in the morning, water flowed into the ditches, providing water for all their armies. And it didn't rain. So where did this water come from? It's kind of interesting over there in Israel, especially, in the southern wilderness area, is it'll rain either up in the mountains or up around Jerusalem. And if it rains a lot, there can be a sudden, deluge of water, suddenly water flowing down all these wadis, all these dry creek beds, and all of a sudden there's all this water around. I mean, you have to watch down there, because one time I was down there right afterwards, one time I was over there, that the road got washed out because of that. It's just a lot of times it's just water coming from other places. And so that water flowed down into these ditches. And so what this tells us is you don't always know where the provision of God's is going to come from. There was no evidence of this rain, of any rain, but still, he provided water in a different way. Just know that God will always keep his promises and take care of his people. Now, the Moabites, they're coming down in that direction, and in the morning, then they see that water, but because of the sun and the reflection and everything, it looks like blood. And so they say, oh, these three kings are killing each other. They got down there, they got in a fight, and they're killing each other. All right, let's go get them. And so they go down there, and it wasn't the way they thought. And Israel specifically starts fighting against them, and they are defeated. And they retreat to the city Kir Hareseth, which, again, you can see it's that city just under the name Moab there. Now, the battle around the city was intense. They were still fighting. It was still really intense. The Moabites were holed up in Kir Hareseth. Then what the king of Moab does, Mesha, what he does is he offers his oldest son as a burnt offering on the wall. Lays his son up on the wall and offers him to his God. And it was so repugnant to everyone that everyone just left. I mean, even the Israelites, the Edomites, the people from Judah, it's like, oh man, that is low. So they all were just so disgusted they left. He went to the extreme to try to get his God to intervene in the battle. There is no, this is the sort of thing that happens when people are worshiping false gods. There's no end to what it'll lead people to. As we read in John 10:10, Jesus saying, the thief doesn't come but to kill, steal, and to destroy. But I have come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. Worshiping the God of convenience has led to the destruction in our nation of many unborn lives. Now in chapter 4, in verses 1 through 7, we have the story of Elisha multiplying the widow's oil. So And what we find here is Elisha's performing miracles similar to those of Elijah, obviously, but also some of the things that Jesus would later do as well. So there's this widow of one of the sons of the prophets. She had 2 sons, but she was in debt because of the death of her husband. And now the creditors were wanting to come and take her 2 sons and sell them into slavery to pay the debt. Elisha asked her what she has in her house, to which she replies, I want one little jar of oil. He says to her, okay, go to all your neighbors, everyone you can think of, and borrow jars from them. Not just a few, but as many as you can get. So she sends her boys out, and all they go and they collect all of these jars. And he tells her to then fill these jars with oil. So she's pouring. She got this, probably, you see a little flask of oil. She's pouring that, and it keeps coming, fills up one jug, fills up another, fills up all of these jars with oil. And then he says to her, sell the oil, pay your debt, pay off the debt, and then live on the rest. Good advice. Pay off your debt, live on the rest. God has resources that we don't know about. Elisha made the woman commit herself to the Lord's provision, that you get focused, you do this. It's like the famous preacher of the 1800s, McLaren, said, you have God in the measure in which you desire him. You have God in the measure to which you desire him. Now in verses 8 through 17, we have the story of the Shunammite woman. Now, one thing we find out about Elisha in comparison or contrast to Elijah is that Elisha is a lot more sociable than Elijah was. Elijah would just come, hit you between the eyes with whatever he was going to tell you and leave. But you see Elisha around people a lot more. Now, she lived, obviously, in the town of Shunem, and she would always see Elisha going back and forth as he's traveling to different places. And so she invited him in to eat. And then, since he traveled by there so often, she got her husband to add a room on for Elisha to stay in. So they gave him an apartment in their house. He wants to bless her with something, but she says, I don't really need anything. I don't need you to go to a king or any predator or anything. I'm good. Don't need anything. But his servant, Gehazi, notices that she doesn't have a son and her husband is old. Now, this was important, and they didn't have welfare systems. So if her husband died and she was alone, she'd be kind of out of luck. So her husband was older and think, she could really use a son, because somebody to, as he gets older, to take care of her in her old age. So Elisha tells her that a year later she would have a son. Now, as years went by, the son, who's older, we're not told exactly how, he's probably a young boy, went out to his father where he was working with their hands, the farm hands. And it seems that he may have had heat stroke. The husband tells the servant to carry him to his mother, and there he's on his mother's knees. That's why we know he's a younger boy, and where he dies. The woman asked her husband to send a young man and a donkey so she can go to Elisha. He questions her reasoning for this because it's not a new moon, it's not a fast or a celebration or anything. But she tells him, oh, it's fine. It's fine. She doesn't tell him that their son is dead. She just tells him that everything's fine. Now, she rides up to Mount Carmel, where Elijah, of course, challenged the prophets of Baal. Elijah and his servant Gehazi see her coming from a distance, and they recognize her. And, well, Gehazi goes down to meet her and ask if all is well. She tells him it is, but when she comes to Elisha on top of the mountain, she falls down and grabs him by his feet. Gehazi wants to shoo her away, saying, you're overdoing it here, lady, if nothing's wrong. And Elijah recognizes there's something wrong, but it says the Lord didn't tell him what it was, and he was kind of floored that God didn't talk to him. He was so used to God showing him and telling him things. In this case, he didn't, so he was amazed by that. So she tells him what happened, and Elisha sends Gehazi to her house with his staff, his rod there, his walking stick. He arrives there and he lays the walking stick on the boy. Nothing happens. But when Elijah gets there, he prays and lays face to face on the boy 3 times, and he rises. Interesting thing about raising the dead. Both Elijah and Elisha pleaded with God to raise the dead. But as in the case of Lazarus, Jesus commanded the dead to rise. Revealing who he was, having the power of life, being God in the flesh. We serve the same God as Elijah and Elisha. And we're told in Mark 16:20 that signs will follow the preaching of the word. It's nowhere says that we're in control of them, but it says signs will follow, and that's God working by his Spirit. Now we have Elisha purifies a pot of stew. There's a famine in the land, and this is in verses 38 through 41. And so the sons of the prophets, they're hungry. There's a famine. There's not a lot of stuff around. So they all go out and start collecting wild stuff to make a stew out of, different gourds and all kinds of stuff like that to make a pot of stew. They go to eat it, and somebody notices that there's something wrong in there, probably by the taste or something, that it says there's death in the pot. They declare there's death in the pot. Elisha tells them to put flour in the pot and serve it to the people, and they do, and everything's fine. The stew was healed. Now in verses 42 through 44, a man brings bread and a bag of grain to Elisha, who says to give it to the people. Interesting. His heart was for the people, probably here referencing again the sons of the prophets. He wanted to make sure that they were fed. Gehazi, which probably his other name is probably Doubting Thomas, says there isn't enough to feed all these people. But Elisha says that the Lord had promised that there would be more than enough. And there was. It was multiplied then with leftovers, like the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Elijah trusted the promise of God, acted upon it, and saw God's miraculous provision. This is what it means to take a venture in faith. You look at the promises of God. You see if that promise is specifically applicable to you. Act upon it and see what God will do. Now in chapter 5, one last story here. We have this Syrian commander named Naaman. This commander was a very successful commander for the Syrians, but he was also a leper. He had that loathsome, incurable disease. Now, in one of his raids into Israel, he had brought back a servant girl, and she served his wife. And this servant girl told him that there was a prophet in Samaria that could heal him, referring to Elisha. So Naaman goes and asks permission of the king, who sends him with a letter to the king of Israel, probably Jehoram at this time. The king of Israel freaks out and thinks the king of Moab is trying to pick a fight, because you're sending somebody here to get healed? I'm sending my commander here, the head of my army, so you can heal him. So, what? Like he says there, am I God that I can heal somebody and make them alive or dead? The servant girl's boasting in God caused a commotion in two nations. Imagine this. She's just talking about what God can do. And it gets these leaders acting. God honors her faith and does something that was not seen in Israel, healing a leper. Up to this point, was never done. And even Jesus says in Luke 4:27, and many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian, because of faith. That's what Jesus is dealing with in that context, dealing with their faith and not trusting the Lord to work. Then in verses 8 through 14, Elisha hears of what's going on and tells the king to send Naaman to him. Naaman comes to Elisha's house and stands at the door. Elisha doesn't come out at all. He just sends him and tells him to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River and you'll be healed. Naaman was offended because he thought, what kind of prophet is this? He should have at least come out and danced around and waved at me or something like that. Just tell me to go dip in the river 7 times? We have better rivers in Syria. They're cleaner than the Jordan. But his servant said to him, well, if he were to ask you something great, wouldn't you do it? He said, yeah. And they say, much less. He's just telling you, go dip in the water. Go do it. And so he did that, and he comes up healed. God had to deal with Naaman's pride before healing him. You see what Elisha was doing when he came to the door and he wouldn't see him? He was treating Naaman like a leper. He was one. And sometimes people want us to treat them as in sort of a way to cover themselves as something they're not. You know, it's like somebody who hasn't accepted the Lord yet is living in sin. They want to come and they want you to treat them like everybody else. And you can't. They have to deal with their sin. They have to deal with the issue of the gospel, faith in Christ. You just can't welcome and this has been such a plague to the church because we've seen over the past several years when you have quote unquote Christian music performers deconverting, they call it. But as I've mentioned before, research has shown that these guys never really confronted their sin, never really dealt with it. They just kind of blended in and started singing Jesus songs rather than really having a life transformation, confronting their own sin and repenting of it. They just blended in. And then when it didn't work for them after a while, they bailed. But again, as he dips in the water, Naaman is healed. Now, he comes back to Elisha in verses 15 through 19 and wants to give him a gift. And he declares there how he now believes in the God of Israel. He is converted. He wants to give this gift out of gratitude, but the prophet refuses because it was God who healed Naaman, not Elijah. We need to lead people by example that the grace of God is free. As Jesus says in Matthew 10:8 to his disciples, heal the sick, cleanse lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. And then after that, Naaman asked permission to take some dirt, a couple of bags of dirt back with him, some bags of Israel dirt, possibly because he wanted to build an altar to the Lord, or wanted to have a place of worship there. He asked for grace as he goes back to Syria because of his obligation to the king to go into the temple of Rimmon, his god, and where he'd have to be supporting the king. And so he would have to bow down with the king there. But he's saying, let that not be held against me. That's not what's going on in my heart. But Elisha didn't approve or disapprove, but he simply sent him on his way. That was something he has to deal with before the Lord. So Elisha wouldn't give him any excuses there. Now in verses 20 through 27, we have a problem with Gehazi. He didn't like the fact that Elisha let Naaman go away without paying anything. He goes, runs out, catches up with Naaman as he's traveling back, and he tells him a lie about needing something for a couple of sons of the prophets that showed up. Naaman gives him a block of silver that's about 240 pounds of silver and 2 changes of clothing. He tries to hide it, but Elisha calls him out, saying, didn't my heart go with you when you followed after the man? And so Gehazi ends up with the leprosy that was on Naaman, bearing the consequence of it. Here again, we see the consequences of covetousness. wanting what somebody else has. It caused Gehazi to think that grace, well, as he lived his life, it could leave the impression with Naaman that grace wasn't totally free. So it's so important for people to be in ministry to be very careful about receiving from people. Not to do it in a way. In fact, one time I remember a story with Pastor Chuck, back in the early days when they didn't have their building yet. A businessman came and offered him $1 million. And back then in the mid-60s, that was a lot of money. And the Lord told him not to take it. He tells the guy, I can't take this because if I take this money from you, you'll think that you built the church. And so instead of God, so I can't take the money. And God provided different ways through a lot of people, smaller amounts, that sort of thing, which is really the way things should be. We should never allow people to think they can buy the grace of God for money, for influence, or anything else. Again, as Jesus said to his disciples when he sent them out, freely you have received, freely give. Freely give. God's perfectly able to provide however he wants to. Our responsibility is to freely give the message of the gospel, the grace of God. So we will stop there. We made it through those chapters. Whew. That was the grace of God. That I got through all that. Anyone have any questions about those passages? There's a lot in there. I'll turn off the mic and you can ask the questions if you like.